You're listening to the podcast of The Branch in Ashland, Virginia. What comes to mind when you hear the words surrender and sacrifice? Do they have negative connotations to you? Over the next few episodes, we're going to look at what it means to surrender and sacrifice our time, our talents, and our treasures to God. What comes to mind when you hear these two words, surrender and sacrifice? The dictionary defines surrender as to cease resistance to an enemy or opponent and submit to their authority. And I think to myself, that's such a negative word. And it just, when we think about it this way, surrender sounds like a really bad thing. And I wonder if it's possible, looking at that definition, if it's possible for us to surrender to someone who's not an enemy. Is it possible for us to hear even the word submit and authority without something kind of rumbling within us? How about the word sacrifice when we think about that word? The dictionary defines sacrifice as the surrender of or destruction of something prized or desirable for the sake of something considered as having a higher or more pressing claim. Sounds a little less negative than surrender, but when we consider to have something to have a higher or a more pressing claim, what are those things in our lives that we say hold that place? But what happens if, in light of these two words, surrender and sacrifice, if we look at them in terms of who we're surrendering to and who we're sacrificing to? Does that change the dynamic at all? Does it change for us how we look at these words? Does it change our definition? Hopefully we don't see God as our enemy, and so this idea of surrendering to God, we shouldn't say, it's him or me. And we shouldn't necessarily think about surrendering either as there's always a winner and there's always a loser in that. If we're seeing it that way, then we're thinking about it wrong, especially when we consider the idea of surrendering to God. So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to look more deeply at these two words, surrender and sacrifice, and we're going to look at them in terms of what that means with our time, with our talents, and with our treasures. The things in our lives that we value, those things that we would probably say have high or pressing claims in our lives. According to surveys conducted in recent years by the Pew Research Center, 52% of Americans are multitasking. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands of those of us who do it, but 52% of you do. 60% sometimes feel too busy to enjoy life. Again, this isn't confession time. I don't have to see a show of hands, but 60% of people feel like they're too busy to enjoy life. If you give those people children under the age of 18, then it goes up, because parents with children under the age of 18, 74% of them say that they feel too busy to enjoy life. A point that is important not just today when we talk about time, but next week when we talk about talents, and the week after that when we talk about treasure as well, is this: we can't surrender or sacrifice something that we don't have. Let me say that again, because I think it's really important for us to know. We cannot surrender or sacrifice something that we don't have. So when we think about our time, why is it that we max out our schedules? Why is it that we have that burning need and desire within us to multitask, those of us who do? Are we trying to keep up with everyone around us? Have we determined that somehow or another their lives are the lives that we need to model ours around? Who are they? Now, prepare, because I stepped on my own toes when I was putting this all together. But for those of us with children, are we using our children as an excuse to do everything? Are we saying, well, I'm really busy because I've got one kid or two kids or three kids or four kids. And we're filling up our schedule and we're multitasking, and then we play the martyr because we've bought into the lies of doing so many things for our children as we run from here to there and everywhere in between. Many of us could easily play a game with ourselves. We could give ourselves $1 for every time that we ask the question, how are you doing, of someone, or someone asks that question of us, and we answer, I'm busy, or they answer, I'm busy. In our culture, in our society, we've almost created it as like a badge of honor. That if someone asks us how we are and we say we're busy, then all of a sudden it looks like we're actually doing stuff. And if we don't say we're busy, then someone might think we're lazy. Someone might think, well, what are you doing then? If you're not busy, then there must be something wrong with you. As we think about the busyness of our lives, of our schedules, that 60% of people who say they're too busy to actually enjoy life, the question that I have for myself and for us is, do we know our own capacity? Do we know our own capacity? Do we know at what point we get filled to the point of overflowing and not in a good way? Where our schedules are so booked, where we're multitasking so many different things that we don't know which end is up, which direction is which, and we feel incredibly overwhelmed. Unfortunately, many of us never slow down enough to understand our capacity. Not only do we not slow down to know it, we don't even ask ourselves that question. We haven't created space in our lives enough that we can stop and ask the question, what is my capacity? What am I capable of doing in a healthy way? We don't have time to do that because the only time that we stop is when we're sick and we're forced to, or we lay our heads on the pillow and hopefully just fall asleep. Some of us have to take stuff just so that our minds will stop. In the created order of things, God created one day out of the week when his creatures were to stop, to cease, to rest from all their draining activity. If we look in Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, this is what we read. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. And so on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Now, why did God rest? It wasn't because he needed to. God wasn't tired out. He didn't say like, hey, I've done all this stuff for 6 days. I'm pooped. Let me go sit down. No. He said, I have done all this creating for 6 days, and now, as part of the created order of things, I need to show you a better way. And so before the fall, what happens in Genesis chapter 3, God intentionally says, I am taking time to show you what it means to stop, to cease, to rest. But of course, we know better, right? Just one chapter later, our beloved ancestors, Adam and Eve, decided that yes, we know better than God. He told us that we can eat from any tree, but we don't want any tree. We want the tree that he told us not to eat from. And so Adam and Eve, they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And we fall, we're broken, we live in a world that's disordered now. That's chaotic from what God originally intended. And if we look at all of our brokenness and all of our sin, I think we can always go back to Genesis 3 and point to that as really the beginning and the core of everything within us that rebels. Because we don't like to be told what to do. We don't like for someone to say no, and our culture definitely doesn't like that. No, if you tell me no, I'm going to say, really? Who are you? How do you have the authority to do that? But God created in the order of things for our good. To stop, to cease, to rest on that seventh day. He didn't need it, but we do. And so what would happen if we surrendered and sacrificed our time to take a weekly Sabbath? Some of us, that thought puts panic and anxiety into us. Well, I can't stop. I can't cease. I can't not do something for a whole day. I wonder, those of us who are feeling that tension inside, and I've asked myself this question, and so I ask you, is it possible that we might be afraid that the world would go on without us if we stopped for a day? Is it possible that maybe things would just keep rolling and we would find that maybe we're not as necessary as we thought we were? Is it possible that we're finding our value and our worth and our identity in what we do? In Luke's gospel, we read an account of two sisters, right? Any of us who have siblings know that there's a tendency for siblings not to get along, right? And this account that Luke includes in his gospel is no different. In Luke chapter 10, we're introduced to Mary and Martha. And Luke writes this. He says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Now, any of you who have siblings, tell me you haven't had that conversation and your parents never heard those words from you. And Jesus says in verse 41, Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Now, let's face it, Mary's tattling on her sister, right? Martha's tattling on her sister. Right? Like, you don't get what you want, you have a conversation with someone, and then because you don't get anywhere, you decide to up the ante. What better place to go than to Jesus, right? Like, hey, my sister's not doing what I want her to do. Instead of going to a parent, since there are no parents around, they're like, hey, well, I'm going to go to Jesus. And I know that Martha going to Jesus in that moment, she's going because she thinks, like so many other people's in the gospel, she thinks she knows how Jesus is going to answer. She's expecting that he's going to side with her. That he's going to go to Mary and say, hey, what are you doing sitting at my feet? Like, go help your sister. She's running around like crazy here. And what does it say that Mary was doing while Martha was caught up in all those preparations? It says she was sitting at the Lord's feet. And then what does Jesus say to her? He says, Mary has chosen the better thing. I guarantee you that's not what Martha was expecting to hear. I don't think she was waiting to hear that. I think, she was waiting to say, you're right, Martha. For those of us type A people who are multitasking all the time, I bet you we wouldn't have expected that either. Because it doesn't necessarily seem like the better thing to just sit there at the feet of Jesus. Scholar and commentator Darrell Bock wrote this about this passage. He said, discipleship sometimes requires that tasks be suspended while fellowship is maintained. In other words, sometimes we have to stop for the good of the relationship. Sometimes we have to stop and be present with someone, not just physically present, spiritually, emotionally present with somebody. Luke writes that Mary was listening at the feet of Jesus while Martha was distracted. The Greek word that Luke uses here is perispao, which means to draw around or about, to be distracted or pulled away. Think about circling something but never getting there. When I lived in Connecticut, there was this movie theater right off the highway. I could always see it, and I drive by it all the time. I just assumed it was really easy to get to because I could see it from the highway. One day I had to actually go there, and there were no signs anywhere. I got off the highway and I'm like, surely this won't take me very long. Intuitively, I should be able to find this theater. And I went all around it and I got back on the highway and I saw it and I said, how do I get there? I imagine that Martha had a very similar experience. She was circling Jesus, but she was never there. She was doing all kinds of things, but she was distracted. And she wasn't sitting at his feet, hearing him, listening. She was missing him. She was pulled away. Sometimes we can sacrifice our time, but it's all doing rather than being. Pastor and author Peter Scazzero reminds us that we're human beings, not human doings. See, God doesn't want us to just do stuff for him. He doesn't want us to just busy ourselves. He wants us. He wants our heart. He wants our time. He wants us to know him as deeply and intimately as he knows us. And Martha found this out through her experience with Jesus because Mary, her sister, chose what was better. And so what does that mean for us? What does it mean for us to surrender and to sacrifice our time? If you spent any amount of time within the church, then you know that, and hopefully you haven't been burned within a church who has totally burned you out by saying, oh, hey, you're a warm body. Let me put you here. Now serve until Jesus comes back and we're never going to check in with you. I grew up in the church and I saw that. We're always in need of volunteers here at the branch. Always. Branch kids, greeting, people leading worship. There's lots of opportunities. But my hope and my prayer for us as a community, as a family, is not that we do things out of obligation or out of drudgery. We say, look busy, be distracted, pretend you're doing something. And my hope is that the things, or most of the things that we do, are energizing, they're life-giving to us. At the same time, we're a small church. So there's always going to be things to get done that may not be everyone's favorite thing, right? Here's the problem. The problem is that many of us, we wait for the things that we only want to do, and we let everything else go to everybody else. And we say, well, that's not really me. I'm not really a greeting person. I'm not really a kid person. I'm not really a singer. So I'm just going to wait until the best thing comes along. Is it possible that maybe, like Martha, the best thing's right under our noses and we haven't really acknowledged it? And Jesus is saying, this is the better thing. That maybe there's surrender and sacrifice required for us with our time. And sometimes we've got to do the things that we might not love, not for our own sake, but for the sake of other people. Remember the definition of sacrifice I shared earlier? The surrender of destruction of something prized or desirable for the sake of something considered as having a higher or more pressing claim. I imagine that most of us see our time as something desirable, as something prized. So are we willing to surrender and sacrifice our time for other people? As we read through the Bible and God talks about the fact that he has given us everything, and then he requests that we give 10% back to him. It's the number that we constantly come back to. That doesn't mean that we go and be Pharisees and say, well, there's 10% exactly. I can't go over, I can't go under. No. He throws that out there and says, hey, like use that to aim at that. God's children are called to give back time, talent, treasure, 10%. What does that 10% of our time look like? The average person is awake for about 16 hours a day. Some of us, if we're awake for more than that, get crabby. So 10% of 16 hours is about 90 minutes a day. Okay? If we all take a Sabbath, that still leaves us 6 days. So the engineer and me had to write an equation. 6 days a week times 1.5 hours a day equals 9 hours a week. That doesn't mean that I have the expectation or anyone has the expectation that you're at the branch 9 hours a week. In fact, if you are, then I'm going to yell at you and say, get out. Because I don't want that to be the case. 9 hours a week doesn't mean that we're always doing. 9 hours a week means that's the hours that we give back to the Lord. Some of that is sitting at His feet. Some of that is serving. Some of that is surrendering and sacrificing. Yes, there are opportunities for us to serve within the walls, but a lot of us aren't here more than an hour a week. That's still 8 more hours that we get to do things, to surrender and sacrifice our time for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the kingdom of God. We can be connecting with people who have yet to meet Jesus. What did Jesus say? Mary did what was better. She sat at the feet of Jesus. Are we spending time with Jesus sitting at His feet? Are we giving our time to others? Are we surrendering and sacrificing for them? And are we serving on Sunday mornings? What does it mean for us to sit at the feet of Jesus? What does it mean to hear Him? What does it look like when our prayers aren't just throwing up all the things that we need, but we're actually listening and hearing the heart of God for us, for our family, for our community? Are we giving time to other people? Are we stopping? Are we ceasing from what we're doing and maybe just being present? Like I do strengths work all the time. Those of us with lots of executing strengths, we're really good at doing things, but we really suck at just being present with people sometimes. At the same time, some of us are really relational and we love to be with people, but don't tell us to do anything. It's not one or the other, it's both and. That God calls us to be together with everyone else, and sometimes we have to actually do some things as well. And then what are we doing on Sundays when we're here for an hour a week? Are we giving back to God? And so where do we start? I can find myself overwhelmed all the time, especially if I don't know where to start. What does it look like to go, sometimes I think in the Christian life, we look at spiritual formation, we look at this process that we call sanctification, and there's this expectation that you go from 0 to 100 in one step. I don't think that's the case. So how do we take baby steps? What about Bob, right? How do we just take small steps? What does it look like for us to just take 5 to 10 minutes per day with Jesus, sitting at His feet, doing what is better, listening to Him, hearing from Him? And then what does it look like for us to just find one person a week to invest in, to just listen to? I'm constantly amazed. I've had so many people come up to me and talk about my wife, Carrie, and they're like, oh, she's so wonderful. She's got such wonderful advice. And I'll talk to her about it afterwards. She's like, I didn't say anything. And I think she has this gift of being present with people and not talking all the time like other people. Sometimes we just need to show up. And investing in someone doesn't mean that we give them anything other than our time. And then find one place where you can serve. It doesn't always have to be here in these four walls. There's plenty of opportunities with plenty of community partners that we have here in Ashland and beyond, that you can go and you can be the hands and feet of Jesus. I highly recommend it. But we've got to start somewhere. And the somewhere that some of us need to start is just finding out how to say no to things. Finding out what our capacity is and realizing that we can't give away what we don't have. If we don't have those extra time, that extra time, those extra hours, we'll never be able to give it away. Jesus told Martha, your sister's doing the better things. I wonder, are the things that we're doing the better things? Let me pray for us. Father, I know for me, I don't like to always acknowledge my limitations. And when I ask the question about capacity, when I ask questions about what I should be doing, I've got to be honest with myself and realize that I have limitations, that I have a capacity. And it's so hard. So God, I pray first and foremost that you would let all of us carve out time to just ask those questions. Father, not in a shaming way, not in a guilt way, but Father, just in a revealing way. Because if we don't know what the issue is, if we don't admit it, then how can we ever be cured of it? And so, Father, I pray that you would open our eyes, open our ears, open our hearts to see and to look at our time, to ask ourselves, how am I surrendering and sacrificing what you've given to me for the sake of others and for the sake of you? I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
We cannot give what we do not have. How much time do you have? Do you feel too busy to enjoy life? What are you going to do to change that? How can you carve out space so that you can serve Jesus, but also sit at his feet? Thanks for listening to our podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at thebranchashland@gmail.com. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, give us a review, and share with your friends and family. Thanks for listening. See you next time.